I'm not eating it. I'm staying off carbs for a while, and it's like torture to make cookies, and they come out of the oven and they're hot and all of that. So, but thank you for allowing me to do a quick recipe today. I know it's 30 minutes. I just want to go over a couple things on the front end. I hope that draping paper and trying to get the lighting right so you can actually see ingredients. So what we'll do is go through the ingredients for this particular recipe. As Makana said, the one I sent out originally was what we call small, but I made a home version, and that has like cup measurements and teaspoons instead of weight, because not everybody has a scale at home. So it should be pretty close. The conversions always are a little bit different when you go from precision weight to cups, because they might be packed or otherwise, but there's a ton of leeway when it comes to cookies. I think the most important thing for folks to understand is what each ingredient does in a recipe. I have a team building class that I do that highlights exactly what the role of each of the ingredients are. So I kind of want to go through that first, because if you can understand what each ingredient does in a recipe, then you can start to understand what might happen if you bake a batch that turns out differently than you expected it to. First up, butter. And usually when I talk about butter, I categorize it as fat, because it does not have to be butter. You can always use shortening if you'd rather. Some cookies call for lard, but any sort of solid fat would work. Traditionally, it is butter. Obviously, you get a little bit better flavor. Eggs, the eggs that we use are large. Keep in mind they're usually about 2 ounces each. So if you go with like an extra large, or if you're using small eggs, you may need to make slight adjustments there as required. And you can find some really good conversions online for cup weight to conversions for measurements. Flour, we just use all-purpose flour. Straight up is perfect for that. Salt. I might mention that I use salted butter in the kitchen too. A lot of recipes call for unsalted. If you have it at home, that's fine. You would just need a little bit more salt. Baking soda. This is important because it causes spread, as opposed to baking powder. If you add baking powder, it's going to rise and be more cake-like. If you do baking soda, it spreads and gives you more of a crisp style cookie. So for this one, we use baking soda. Sugar. We've got granulated and brown. You could go straight granulated, or you could go straight brown. This one is equal parts. So I find that to be about perfect for this particular recipe. And then basically we use vanilla and a lot of the standard shortbreads and chocolate chip cookies and things like that. If you wanted to make a cookie with cranberries, I think I have that option on here, and white chocolate chips, it might be nice to put in a little bit of almond extract or something a little bit different. So there's a lot of variations, a lot of options that you can do. It's just understanding what these things do. So you've got your fat, you've got your binding agent from the eggs, the sweetness from the sugar. The sugar also gives a little spread. The spread from the baking soda, flour that helps hold everything together, salt for flavor, and vanilla for flavor as well. Okay. And this is imitation, sorry. It's about $7. If this were a real vanilla extract, it'd be about $150. So we go with the budget one. So you might have to, you can use the extracts or the straight pure ones if you want, or if you have the paste at home, whatever works. Okay, any questions on those? No. So if you look at the recipe, and I'm going to go off of the first one that I sent, we've got the sugar, the butter, the granulated sugar, the egg, vanilla, baking soda, all-purpose flour, and then at the end is the chocolate chips or the cranberries or nuts or whatever. You can put whatever you want in it. In this particular one, I'm only doing chocolate chips. We don't use nuts in the kitchen up here just because of allergies, but at the end, you guys feel free to put in whatever you want into your cookie dough. And then the method that we use for this is called the creaming method. So it's basically where you mix together and cream the fat and the sugar first till it's sort of light and a little bit fluffy. It can be done by hand, it can be done on a mixer. Either way works fine. The most important thing there is to make sure that your butter or your fat is at room temperature. if you tried to stir sugar into butter that was cold, it's never going to happen. You've got to use soft butter. So this one is sat out for a couple hours and it's good to go. And you'll see that when I mix it up over here. Same thing with your eggs. You don't want your eggs cold, because when you put ice cold, or not ice cold, but refrigerated cold eggs into your cold or your warm butter, all of a sudden it's going to cool that down and make it harder to stir as well. So be aware of that. If you don't take your eggs out in advance, about an hour, you can also take them out, put them in a little bit of warm water, and that'll warm them up in just a couple minutes. So you can just run a little warm water over them, let them sit in that, and that helps warm them up really, really quickly. In the shell, not out of the shell. It won't work if you take it out of the shell. Okay? So then hopefully you can see this tray here, this table. Is that visible to you guys? Can't really see from where I'm at. I think so, yeah? Okay, cool. So I've scaled the same ingredients here, and you can see, hopefully, I've taken the butter and put it in here, and you can just see how soft it is. It's kind of warm in the kitchen already today. Keep in mind, in summer, it's going to be a little bit different, right? You may have to make adjustments by putting your butter into the refrigerator for a little bit if it starts to melt on you. You don't want it melting on you, because then the water will separate. It creates a different style of cooking. But butter will melt at about 88 degrees, and as you know, in the summer, it gets a little hotter than that. It can be a problem for you. So it's just one of those things that you got to watch for. But right now, this is perfect. And that's just the butter. So I'm going to do the creaming method. In goes the sugar, the granulated, and the brown. This bowl should be, it's going to be pretty. I never mix this stuff by hand, you guys, so I hope you appreciate it. I'm always using a mixer. But at home, you can do it by hand, or you can do it in a mixer. It's fun for kids too. But the mixing for the creaming method takes a couple minutes. Even if you were to put a glove on, you could do this by hand. A lot of times you can get in there and do it by hand. So I'm going to set this down, mix it up. I also pulled out a stiff whisk. This is a French whisk. So this is one that's not really light. It's a little bit thinner. So it's not designed for whipping eggs, which is called a balloon whip. This is a French whip that's stiffer. And if you happen to have one of these, they can work as well for the initial creaming. You just have to come back. Note that it'll obviously stick in the middle. Tap your whisk. And all of this stuff will come out. So if you do have a stiff whisk, you can use one of those. A lot of people use rubber spatulas. As long as they're not too flexible and they don't flop around, you need something stiff enough to get a mixture in there. But you will need that later. So I think the recipe said mixing for 5 minutes. I don't think I'm going to do that today. One thing to note, if you are using a KitchenAid mixer or a small handheld beater mixer, you don't want to incorporate too much air into it. What happens there is you create air cells. So when your cookies bake, they rise up and then they'll collapse. So you do want a tiny bit of air, but not a lot. You can't, if you go crazy with this and whip it for 10 minutes on a machine on medium speed, then you're going to end up with a lot larger air pockets. So all of these little techniques kind of contribute to the finished result of your cookie. If you're looking for one of the cookies that rises up and collapses, then you would want to do that. So you can see, maybe, I hope, I don't know, how it's going to come together. And this is a really nice spread for toast, right, Jackie? Take your toast, a little brown sugar and butter mixture, a little cinnamon in there would be really nice. It's good for you. And then the next step is to incorporate the eggs. And it's important to do these one at a time. I have a double yolk here, so they're smaller, but there's two. But That should not impact the recipe. So once it's creamed together, I just add 1 egg. And I incorporate that. You don't want to dump all your eggs in at one time because there's water and moisture in them. You're adding that to fat, so fat and water don't mix and it'll slosh around. It takes you a little bit longer. But you can see, look at, 10 or 15 stirs and it incorporated that one individual egg. And then you just have to repeat it. This has 5 eggs. And feel free, if you guys have questions, let me know. I don't know if Kawai's watching today. She should be my assistant. She's gone through my class. I should bring her up next time.
Just so you guys know, yes, I just put in the chat. If you have any questions during Chef Dan's instructions, go ahead and put it in the chat and I'll moderate. So we don't want to interrupt Chef Dan. So if you have any questions, then go ahead and put it in the chat and then we can ask when the time.
So there's the 4th egg, and then you'll see it start to lighten up in color and in the body of it. And it gets obviously a little bit thinner, easier to stir because you're adding that liquid. And then the last egg. So I'm not sure if it's possible to see the little air pockets that are starting to form. Just from that little bit of stirring, it's lightened it up a little bit.
Chef Dan, while you're mixing, I do have a question. Bonnie asked, how many cookies will this batch make?
It depends. I've got, later when we scoop them, I'll show you. I don't know if you can see these 3 scoops. So if you're using this one, you get a lot more than you will if you get this one. This is like a 5-ounce cookie. This will make about a 3-ounce cookie. This makes about a 1-ounce cookie. So it's sort of up to you. And then you can also at home, if you don't have a scoop, just use spoons. So you could actually take this dough when it's done and spread it, pack it into a sheet pan or a square pan, rectangular pan, and you'd end up with just a bar type cookie. So it's always sort of up to you. I'll also show you a technique at the end of rolling a log that you can put in the fridge and then cut, like the dough you get at the supermarket.
Chef Dan, I do have another question. How from Early College asks, why do you not mix the eggs prior to tossing them in?
Just one extra step that's not really necessary. You could, but it's kind of hard to control adding 1 egg at a time. So it would still work, and then you could just add a little bit and stir it in. But kind of like that story about someone who's learning how to cook the ham at home at Christmas, and they always cut the end off and set the end aside and roast the ham in the oven. And the daughter asks her mom, how come she does that? And she says, well, that's the way my mom taught me. So then she goes and asks her grandma, and she says, well, when I was little, the ovens were too small and we couldn't fit the ham in, so we had to cut the end off. So it's just sometimes traditions carry forward. So I always come back to the science. What's the science? What if anything would be the impact of that difference? And none. So you could mix them up, pour them in. So now we have what you might add at home. This might be too big a batch. Depends on how big your family is. If you're by yourself, this will last you a while. Larger families, maybe not. All right. So then if you look, we've got the vanilla extract. Just going to put that in. And remember, you're stirring liquid into fat, so be careful. It'll take a minute to incorporate. And don't go crazy. It can splatter all over. There we go. All right. Now, the next step is the dry ingredients. So I've got my baking soda measured here. If you buy it in Hawaii or any place where it's really humid, you'll find it tends to clump up. Even if you have it in your cupboard at home, if it's been opened or if it's been in the fridge, humidity, it'll absorb that really, really well, and then you end up with these rocky clumps. So make sure you sift that, very important. Nobody wants a chunk of baking soda in there. So I'm pouring that in. Actually gonna add my pinch of salt and just incorporate those. And the last thing that we have, at least in terms of creating the cookie dough base itself, is the flour. So again, sift it if you can at home. Another trick you can do is take a whisk. I use a balloon whisk. If I'm in a real big hurry and I have large batches, I'll just whisk my flour to break up any lumps. So if it's a really hot, humid summer and your flour's been open for a while, you might end up with more lumps. But again, you don't want to overmix your dough when we get to the end, and you certainly don't want a chunk of flour when you bite into a cookie or a cake or anything. This bowl will actually fit. I was wondering about that. And now this is the one of the most important parts, right? Cookie dough is less complex than cakes and other things. But what happens, this is a really important theory or concept of the physics of baking. Once flour comes into contact with any form of moisture, and we have moisture here in the form of our eggs, a little bit in the butter, it starts to develop the protein and the structure, right? So the more you stir flour with moisture, then the stiffer and firmer whatever it is that you're making becomes. Cakes, you fold the flour in as lightly as possible. Cookies, the same thing. Bread, the opposite. We mix it for a long period of time because we want structure. We want that bread to rise, hold its shape, and stay that way. We don't want it to collapse. So when you're making muffins or cookies or cakes, you always only incorporate the flour or stir the flour in until it's incorporated. You never go crazy and just keep going, letting it mix, or your cookies will become too tough. And you can see maybe it's starting to break up and fall into place, come together. And if you're planning on putting in chocolate chips or cranberries or anything else, you only want to mix this flour until it's about 90% incorporated. And the reason we do that is because we're going to continue to stir once we put the chocolate chips or whatever inside. So you'll again be mixing a little bit more. So you don't want to overmix the flour. So in this case, you can see it's pretty close to coming all together. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to add my chocolate chips. If you do make that first recipe that I sent, that's a lot of chocolate chips. This recipe came from the Ritz-Carlton right when I came out of college. I went to Maui, worked at Kapalua. So that was 1994. I've been making this recipe since 1994, 26 years. And they tend to use, lots of chocolate, lots of nuts and things like that. Like I said, we remove the nuts, but you can add other things. So if you feel like it's too much chocolate and you want to scale back on it, feel free to do so. For me, I like lots of chocolate chips. And anyone who buys them in the cafe here, hopefully notices that there's like lots of chocolate chips in there. That's the way we like it. So then this I just incorporate and gently stir together.
Chef Dan, I have a question from Mike.
Yeah, go ahead.
He says, what causes cookies to be chewy versus crunchy? Is it the size of cookies, temperature, and length of baking time?
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of factors that can impact that. Baking time for sure. Actually, I flattened a couple cookies today before I baked them so that they would be thinner and crisper. I like them that way sometimes. If they're taller and if you use a scoop, like I'll show you in a minute, it tends to be chewier. The temperature, of course, will impact that as well. And then also the ingredients. If you come back and you look at any short website lesson on basic baking of cookies, you'll see the ingredients have an impact on it. So for example, brown sugar has molasses in it, which is a hygroscopic sugar, which means it absorbs moisture from the air. So if you bake the same recipe with only white sugar, it would be more crisp than it would be if it were including some brown sugar. So some recipes call for honey, or if you like ginger cookies, anybody? I love them myself. There's a chewy ginger cookie, and then there's the crisp one. The chewy one has molasses in it. The crisp one does not, because the molasses will absorb the moisture. So this is coming together now, about where I want it. And now you just mix it until those nuts, or excuse me, the chocolate chips are evenly incorporated. That's not too big a batch for home, is it? That's like 6 pounds. Let me show you really quick. So then for scooping, I'm going to just use the medium-sized scoop. And what's really important here is, especially when you're teaching, there's a difference between one scoop and one scoop, right? So someone might say, oh, hey, that's one scoop, right? Because you get it all in one. Anytime you use an ice cream scoop, it's always a level scoop. So you take it, you scrape it, and there's your scoop, and you drop it on your pan. So I have a pan here. I can just scoop a couple and show you. Again, a nice level scoop. The other thing you have to keep in mind for that is, if you're running a business, how do you control cost if every scoop is different? You put some out that are flat, you put some out that are like that. One person gets a cookie twice as big as the other person. Cost you more, and it's hard to control the perception for the customer, right? So one day they get a giant cookie for $1, the next day it's small, and they're dissatisfied.
Chef Dan, Kehao is asking, how far apart do they go on the?
Yeah, good question. These cookies don't spread that much, maybe about maximum double the size of the scoop. So, I could easily put 3 by 4 on this pan. I'm only going to put 5 right now. So then this would bake, and then what we do here, we bake them at 325 for about 12 minutes is exactly what we do. So your home oven's going to be a little different. So I think I usually put 350, unless you have a convection oven. If you're at home and you have a fan, a convection oven, some of the more modern ones, then 325 would work. But keep in mind, right? So if it's a higher temperature, it's going to brown on the outside more quickly, but the center will stay gooey. So it'll be up to you to sort of experiment with what it is that you want. If you want it flattened out, these will flatten a little bit, but if you want a thinner, crisper style cookie, you can come back and just flatten it by hand. Here's one quick tip too for probably, I would say, like 90% of your cookie doughs. You should be able to touch them and they don't really stick to your hand, right? If you touch it and you get just a teeny little trace of batter stuck, that's perfect. If you touch it and it's really sticky and goopy, then you're not going to have enough flour in it. So you'll learn those little tricks, but that's what I would recommend you do to test it. And then always just scoop one cookie, bake it, and see what happens, right? You don't want to scoop all of these, put them in the oven, pull them out and realize you forgot salt, or you forgot baking soda, or you forgot something else. You want to always do a test. So that becomes important. And then once they're baked, just like Martha Stewart, right? Pull them out of the oven. And you can see how they flattened out a little bit. I like them like crisp on the outside, but gooey on the inside. And that's right where these are, with lots and lots of chocolate chips, which you probably can't see. I'll just press this one back together so someone can pick it up later. No, I'm just kidding. I'll set that aside. So I will have a tray of cookies out for folks that are on campus if you want to swing by the back door of the cafe. you're welcome to do that. And let me show you a log. I have it in the fridge because it has to stay cold. Let me show you this really quick. This is another technique. This is what we do in here. We don't take the time to scoop them. Scooping works best for perfectly consistent cookies, but what we do is take 3 pounds of dough, press it onto a sheet pan or a sheet paper, and then we roll it up into a log. And then we put these in the freezer. So when we make, 60 pounds of dough, we divide it up into 3-pound logs. So we end up with 20 logs. And then, maybe we just pull one a day, let it come to room temperature, refrigerated temperature, and then we just cut it whatever size we want. So it makes it a lot more fast and efficient. And then you just monitor your what you have in the freezer to reproduce whatever it is that you're short on. The last thing I'll show you, I think I have a minute left. I don't know, I have 2 clocks, both of them, the time's different. If you mix this dough and you skip the last part, right? So no chocolate chips, no nuts, no dry ingredients, whatever. It's a great cookie dough by itself. It doesn't need anything. You can scoop that, bake it. I call them brown sugar shortbreads. It's not really a shortbread, but that's what we call them. It certainly reduces the cost of what it is that you're making because the chocolate is a little bit more expensive. But I also lined up a few things that you probably can't see back here, or at least see very well. Peanut butter, right? I know Troy likes peanut butter cookies. If you take that base dough and stir in some peanut butter, works great. That's where you can come back a little green tea powder. If you wanted a green tea flavored cookie, I'd probably eliminate the brown sugar, straight white, and then just go with tea. Espresso powder works good, cocoa nibs, any candied fruit, any dried fruit, your favorite nut, whatever it is. There's just the possibilities are limitless. So how are we doing on time? Is that about right? Good, good. Any questions though?
Yep, there is 2 questions, Chef. Maria Elena asked if she could use wax paper if we want to.
They still make wax paper. I've only used wax paper like once, and it's smoked and stuff, so I never used it again. It would be perfect for rolling up, but I don't know if it's still made the same. That was probably 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But you can buy the nice parchment paper now. Most of your like Chef's owners, your nicer supermarkets will have actually the parchment paper. But for the logs, no problem. Even plastic wrap, aluminum foil, it doesn't have to be perfectly round. You could sort of roll a log and wrap it up with plastic wrap. Yep.
And then I have another question, Chef. How long will it last in the freezer?
I'll let you know in the fall when we open. I'm telling you what, I'm selling that dough. I made a bunch. I think I'm always on the spectrum of on the side of things lasting longer. I actually had some lamb at home the other day that I'd had in the freezer for like 2 years, and it was great. It was awesome. But depend if you talk to the supermarket or the butcher, they're going to tell you to throw it away after 3 months in the freezer. If it's wrapped and sealed tightly, and if you were going to keep it for a long time, I'd double wrap this in plastic wrap. We keep it in a closed cabinet, so I don't have to wrap it. But I mean, it's sugar, high sugar content. You can even leave this dough out on the counter for a couple of days, and it's not a problem. The sugar content's so high. But and I would say a year, it's not a problem. Any other questions?
Yeah, any other questions? You guys can unmute yourself if you want to ask individual questions.
No.
Hey, I had a question.
Yeah.
I'm not too sure if you said this already because my video got a little cut off. But did you see how to make edible cookie dough out of this recipe? Like instead of baking it, you could just use.
Oh, like the raw cookie dough thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a trend right now. I guess there's some shops where you get ice cream cone type stuff with cookie dough. I wouldn't invest in that business. Although cookie dough is good, I don't want a bowl of it. Our eggs are pasteurized. So if you look at the store and or wherever it is that you shop, you should be able to find eggs that are pasteurized. Or you could almost, if you're not baking it, just eliminate the eggs. So it's just butter, sugar, whatever it is you're putting in terms of chocolate chips or whatnot. There's nothing in there that's really going to spoil if you're removing the eggs. But you could also do it with pasteurized eggs, so that if you want to bake half of it and then eat the other half raw, it's up to you.
Okay, that's good to know. Mahalo.
Yeah, of course.
Yes, Dan? Chef?
Yes.
You know my proclivity for strange things, but in terms of the previous question having to do with how long something keeps in the freezer, I just bought a new freezer before in March and was shifting stuff from one freezer to the other to, you know, whatever. And I ran into, and I freeze everything in Cool Whip containers because they're good. And I date everything that I put in the freezer. And I discovered in the very bottom of the old freezer, 2 Cool Whip containers of beans that were frozen in March of 2000. Now, I'm not a big bean fan, so I didn't want them anyway, so I disposed of them. And I now have been working my way through, in chronological order, the other kinds of things. I'm now up to 2007. I had some split pea soup, which was fabulous, actually, from 2007. I'm now looking for something that I did in 2008 and 2009. And I told the story online to some of my friends. And one of them said, what I am doing is archaeological cooking.
Yeah. Well, you could do vintage, right? Maybe we could market that, right? Vintage, split pea soup 2014 or whatever. So every year it's a different vintage. If you're dealing with non-potentially hazardous foods, items that don't have the high potential to get you really, really sick, proteins and things like that, you have a lot more leeway. Split pea soup maybe had some ham in it, but if it's frozen, for the most part, the main thing you have to worry about is the quality of the texture. So if you were to scoop these cookie dough balls, like I showed you, and then freeze them, and then put them in a Ziploc bag, those won't last as long because they'll get frost around them, and that'll impact the taste and the quality. But if it's a log that's sealed in paper, wrapped tight in plastic wrap, probably twice, you'd be a lot better off. So, yeah, I think we err on the side of caution, certainly in the U.S., but everybody's a little bit different. So.
Well, that energy gets.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We're kind of running out of time, but thank you so much, Chef Dan. Thank you, everyone, for coming out this whole week for our daily dose of WCC. But hope you guys have a fabulous Friday and a wonderful weekend.
Thanks for coordinating. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Good to be up here. Come on in.
Thanks for everything.